Today is one of those occasions where the Sunday Mass, the Sunday after Pentecost, is overshadowed by a greater feast that occurs on the day, like today being August 6th. We celebrate the feast of the Transfiguration of our Lord, which we just read about in the Gospel account for today. And there's a couple points I want to bring up about this. We read, first of all, the epistle of St. Peter, where he's speaking about this because he's one of the ones that saw it. And many years later was writing, saying, we're not just telling you fables. We're not just coming up with stories. These are things that happened. I saw this. This is what happened. And this was indeed something that, besides what we saw, this is Christ fulfilling all the prophecies of the Old Testament. It's basically in a nutshell what St. Peter was saying in the epistle today. But the event that happened when our Lord was transfigured was, in a way, not a miracle. It was a withdrawing of a miracle, the cessation of a miracle that had been going on for 33 years. Our Lord shining like the sun is a quality of a risen body. It was a natural effect of the humanity of Christ being united with the divinity of the second person of the Blessed Trinity. But in order to converse with men, to instruct them, as well as to accomplish his mission of redeeming mankind of suffering and dying for them, Christ concealed under the veil of his humanity that divinity that would have shone through and set him apart from the rest of mankind. For the first time, these three apostles saw our Lord, his divinity shining through his human nature. And so on Mount Tabor, he interrupted his miracle of concealing his divinity, which had been ongoing for 33 years. And it's hard not to think of the Blessed Sacrament and that great miracle which we have present on our altars, in which not only is Christ coming down, the bread and the wine being changed, the substance being changed into the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ through the priest. Not only is this a great miracle, but in this case, our Lord hides not only his divinity, but also his humanity. He is truly present here, just as he is truly present in heaven, just as truly present as he was on Mount Tabor, shining like the sun, just as truly present as he was on the cross, bleeding and dying for us. And on our altars, we have this great miracle of miracles before us every day. The second thing I want to point out is regarding the choice of the three apostles that went with our Lord. These three were chosen, and the other 9 were left behind. And it was for a reason, obviously. Our Lord always had a reason for everything he did. There are many reasons, but for one thing, these 3 in particular needed to be strengthened in their faith. Peter was to be the head of the church, the vicar of Christ. James was to be the first martyr amongst the apostles. And John, by his gospel, was to defend the divinity of Christ against the many false teachers that arose in the first few centuries after Christ. And so they had a special reason, a special need to have a further proof of the divinity of Christ. But it was also because our Lord also chose them to be with him in Gethsemane at the agony of the garden. The other 9 were left behind, but those 3 were taken with our Lord into the inner garden, as it were, and there they witnessed the horrible transformation that took place when our Lord allowed himself to suffer the death pains, to foresee his passion in every little detail, and to suffer it in his soul, to suffer the bloody sweat, the fear and the sadness. They were witnesses of how far our Lord would go in suffering all that man does suffer. They were on Mount Tabor to see him in his glorified state, to strengthen them in that hour when they'd see his divinity most diminished, and to even pray that the chalice would pass. From this, we ought to be reminded and encouraged by the fact that God will not permit us to be tempted beyond our strength, that if he has some work or task for us to accomplish, he will prepare us for it and continually provide for us all that we need to carry it out. Every little detail of our future is known to him, and every detail he will provide for, as he did for these three apostles. And the last point I wish to make is that St. Paul says, as you are partakers of the sufferings of Christ, so shall you be also of the consolation. If it were not for Gethsemane, the apostles would have had no Mount Tabor. If it weren't for witnessing Christ's agony, they would not have witnessed his transfiguration. If it were not for the crucifixion, there would have been no resurrection. We see this pattern throughout Christ's life, throughout the lives of the saints, especially that of the Blessed Virgin Mary. She did indeed witness the joy of the birth of Christ, but she also suffered in that her beloved Son and her God suffered. She had the joy of the presentation of in the temple, but she also had the sorrow that pierced her heart, knowing that her Son would suffer and die. She had the joy of finding Christ in the temple, but only after 3 agonizing days of his loss. She had the 30 years with him in Nazareth, in closest companionship with him, but she also had the 30 years of knowing that as she grew in love for him, so her suffering would be the greater, and knowing that that day would come. She had the joy of witnessing him first when he rose from the dead, but she also stood at the cross. The servant is not above his master, our Lord has told us. If we would be like Christ, like his mother, like his apostles, and like all of the saints in their glory, we must be like them in their sufferings as well. The servant is not above his master. If there was another way, Christ would have walked it for us and given us the example. But he did not walk another way. He walked the way of the cross. He suffered these things and so entered into his glory. If we would have our whole life be like Mount Tabor, then our eternity will be like Gethsemane, but incomprehensibly worse. On the other hand, if our life on earth is more like Gethsemane, then our eternity will be like Mount Tabor, only incomprehensibly greater. If we suffer, we shall also reign with him, as St. Paul says. It is indeed a struggle, but we must remind ourselves of this over and over and over again. When sufferings and crosses come to us, we must not suffer as those who have no hope, but rather we have to strive to look upon these crosses as opportunities to imitate our Lord and his apostles and all of the saints, particularly his Blessed Mother. They are opportunities to follow in his footsteps, and so merit the happiness of heaven. Let us strive to see these crosses in our lives as little stepping stones that, following after Christ, are the stepping stones